At the ragged edge of the village, where the carefully ploughed fields thinned and frayed into a tangle of thorny woods, Lena lived in a weathered house that leaned ever so slightly with the wind. Time had settled into the bones of the house, warping its beams and yellowing the windows so that everything beyond the glass looked a little older, a little more distant. Her bedroom window, framed by a pale, peeling paint, overlooked the neglected back garden, and beyond it, standing alone like a forgotten sentinel, loomed an ancient tree. Its bark was blackened and cracked, its branches knotted into shapes that clawed against the sky, as if trying to stitch themselves into the clouds. Lena spent most evenings perched by the window, sketchbook resting lightly on her knees, pencil drifting lazily over the paper in slow, absent-minded arcs. She loved the hour when the sun poured molten gold across the fields, turning the sky grass into a sea of burning copper. The whole world seemed to exhale, and for a brief, tender moment, there was a hush so deep it felt sacred, as if the earth itself were holding its breath, unwilling to disturb the crumbling stillness. It was during one of these soft, dying evenings that Lena first noticed something different. In the crook of the old tree, half swallowed by thickening shadows, something was perched. Not a bird. It was too large for that. Not the jagged outline of broken wood either, no matter how her mind tried to fit the shape into something ordinary. Something else. Something entirely wrong. She narrowed her eyes, pressing her forehead slightly against the cool glass. The figure sat impossibly still, its silhouette sharp against the bleeding hues of twilight. It faced her window directly. Though dusk and distance conspired to keep its features hidden, it gave no sign of breathing or movement. It simply waited, coiled in a posture that spoke of impossible patience. Her hand, as if pulled by a string, moved to her pencil. She drew it without thinking, her fingers sketching rapid, rough outlines, the uneven curve of a hunched spine, the sweep of limbs that seemed too long, too thin for any human body. Each evening she returned, and each evening, like a fixed star in the darkening sky, the figure remained. Over time her sketches grew more detailed. Almost against her will, what began as a blurry, smudged impressions sharpened into intricate renderings. The heavy slouch of the shoulders, the way one arm dangled uselessly, the crooked fingers curling around a branch with disturbing tenderness. But no matter how much she stared, no matter how fiercely she sketched, the face refused her. It remained a smear of a shadow, an absence so deliberate it unsettled her more than any detail might have. Her pencil would snag, hesitate, and slip past the place where the face should be, leaving the page blank and trembling. When Lena, in a moment of quiet unease, mentioned it to her friends, their responses became quick and sharp, as if battling away an annoying insect. Nothing more than a branch caught at the wrong angle, a trick of the dying light, a fancy, bred from too many long, lonely hours staring out the window. They smiled and went back to their conversations, their chores, their cups of tea. But Lena knew better. Every dusk the colours drained from the world and the cold air pressed like a second skin against the windows. The watcher was still there, silent, still, patient, waiting, she thought, not for her to notice it. She had already done that, but for something deeper, something she had not yet begun to understand. Lena sat by the window, the last thread of the evening light spilled weakly across her sketchbook, her pencil making slow, looping strokes she barely registered. Outside the garden sagged under the weight of late summer, overgrown and wild, the fence half swallowed up by creeping ivy, beyond it the woods, pressed close, the trees leaning in with the thick, heavy silence of dusk. Her gaze drifted lazily across the scene, the way it often did at that hour, when the world would seem to slow, when even the air felt tired and heavy. It was only a flicker at first, a dark mass tucked into the ancient tree that stood alone just past the garden's edge. At first glance Lena thought it was nothing, another thick branch among many, twisted and blackened against the bleeding colours of the sky. Once again she nearly dismissed it, but something about the shape pulled at her, unsettling and stubborn. There he was again. As the minutes slid past and the fields darkened to a muted grey, she noticed it again. The wind stirred the leaves and bent the grasses low, but the figure did not move. It remained rigid, unnaturally still, too sharply formed to belong to the wild snarl of the branches around it, A slow tight unease curled in Lena's stomach. She knew she was seeing it again. The figure was hunched low in the crook of the tree, balanced there with a terrible, unnatural poise. Its limbs once again hung at odd angles, the joints crooked as if strung up like a marionette. Though distance and fading light blurred the finer details, Lena knew, with a certainty she did not want to examine, that it was facing her, staring. Leaning closer, she pressed her palm against the cold glass. A thin patch of breath fogged the pane. She could not make out a face. There was only a smear of darkness, a void that refused to sharpen into anything human. Yet somehow she knew, the thing in the tree was aware of her. It had noticed her long before she had noticed it, and now it was waiting. At first Lena thought she was simply tired. Summer was fading, and with it came a heaviness that seemed to settle over everything, the fields, the trees, even the air itself. Days passed in a slow, syrupy drift. The ordinary rhythms of her life softened at the edges, blurring into something that felt too fast and too slow. She sat still by the window each evening, sketchbook balanced on her knees, pencil poised in her hand. She still gazed out across the back garden to the tree, waiting without knowing exactly what she was waiting for. But the drawings had changed. It was subtle at first, a few extra lines she didn't remember making, shadows smudged in places she thought she had left blank. She brushed it off. She told herself she had simply lost track of time, that she had been half asleep as she worked, yet the drawings grew stranger with each passing night. She would start a simple sketch, the curve of a branch, the vague outline of a figure hunched in a tree, and then drift into sleep without meaning to. Hours later she would wake to find the sketchbook full. Whole pages crowded with images she had no memory of. Thick forests, their trees fused together like twisted ribs, face hidden behind curtains of bark, long spindly figures perched among branches, peering outward with eyeless faces. She stopped leaving her sketchbook open at night, but it made no difference. Whether hidden under her bed, tucked inside a drawer, or pinned beneath a pillow, each morning brought new additions. Ink-black lines sprawling over the pages like roots, growing without her permission, reaching for something unseen. And there were other signs. She began waking at strange hours, her body stiff and shivering, her throat dry as paper. The bedsheets were often tangled around her legs, smeared with streaks of dirt and crushed leaves. When she lifted her hands to the weak light of morning, she found her nails packed with earth. The tips of her fingers scratched raw as if she had been digging. She scrubbed her hands clean each morning, but the dirt always returned, stubborn and silent, as if it were seeping into her from somewhere deeper than the skin. Worse still was the clock. The small plastic alarm clock on her bedside table had always been dependable. A dull red glow she barely noticed. By now, night after night, she woke to find it glaring back at her with the same time, 3:17 a.m. It did not matter when she fell asleep, early evening, just past midnight, or long after she tried to tire herself into oblivion. She always woke in the same breathless moment, 3:17 a.m, as if the world itself paused to mark her waking. Sometimes in the thick dark of those hours she would hear the softest sounds against her window, not the rattle of wind, not the scrape of branches, a different sound. Softer, slower, a deliberate tapping, as if fingertips, damp with soil, were brushing against the glass. Each time she would lie frozen under her blankets, heart hammering, willing herself not to look, but the urge was always there, gnawing at her. When she finally summoned the courage, she would find the window empty, and the old tree black and silent against the faint shimmer of stars. And she never shook the feeling that something was there, just beyond the thin pane of glass, just out of sight, watching, waiting, not simply observing her from a distance, but unravelling it, pulling at the seams, drawing her closer, night after night, towards something she had not yet found the strength to name. Sleep became a stranger to her, a broken, uneasy thing that offered no real rest. In the shallow hours of night, when the world outside pressed heavy against this house, Lena's dreams took on a life of their own. She dreamed of the earth, black and wet, parting around her. Dreamed of her lying beneath the soil, her body still, as something cold and patient coiled through her. Roots. They threaded up through her spine, winding between her ribs, splitting and merging as they grew. She could feel them burrowing into the marrow of her bones, wrapping her heart in a slow, suffocating embrace. It didn't hurt, it was worse than that. It felt inevitable, as if she had always been meant to become part of the earth, something old and silent and still. In these dreams the great tree from the garden rose above her, its bark splitting in long, open, wet lines. Eyes stared out from the wounds, dozens, maybe hundreds, wide and blinking and wet with dull red light. They followed her as she sank deeper into the soil, 1,000 gazes heavy with something she could not name, something like recognition. She spoke from these dreams gasping, heart pounding against the cage of her chest, her hands clawing at the sheets as if trying to escape. Yet even awake, the feeling clung to her, a hollow space growing inside, a gnawing certainty. She was not meant to be inside anymore. The house once a refuge now felt too small, too stale. The walls seemed to press inwards, heavy with the wrong kind of air. The ceiling sagged closer each night, and the doors rattled quietly even when there was no wind. Out there, beyond the garden, beyond the safety of the walls, something waited. And more Lena could feel it calling her home. The night was thick and airless, the kind that weighed heavy on the skin, pressing Lena deeper into her tangled sheets. Sleep had come fitfully, dragging her under in slow, reluctant waves. Her mind floated in a dark sea, dreams whispering at the edges but refusing to take full shape. Somewhere in the murk of half-sleep she stirred. The first thing she noticed was the cold. It seeped into her bones, far colder than the room should have been, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and old wood, a breath of something older than the house, older than her. She shifted under the covers, her body sluggish, her limbs heavy with strange numbness. For a long moment she lay still, the thick silence of the house pressing against her eardrums. No sound of the radiator ticking, no creak of settling wood, only the muffled thud of her own heartbeat quickening by the second. Her eyes blinked open. The room was steeped in darkness, so complete that it seemed to fill her mouth and lungs. She stared upward, disorientated, the ceiling too far away, the shadows too dense. It took her several heartbeats to realise she was awake, truly awake, and not caught in another of her endless rotting dreams. Confusion tugged at her, a low hum in her chest. Then, through the blackness she heard it. At first it was only a brush of sound, so faint she thought it might be the blood rushing in her ears. She held her breath instinctively, straining to hear. The noise came again, soft, dry, like leaves dragging against stone. It was not coming from within the house. It came from outside, from beyond the thin shell of the walls. It came from the garden, from the tree. A ripple of dread rolled through her. Her hands gripped the edge of the blanket, fingers curling into the fabric, but she could not bring herself to sit up. She turned her head slowly, her muscles leaden, and looked towards the window. The curtains hung limp, a pale shield against the dark, but they could not keep out the voice. Closer now, almost inside the room with her, a whisper. There is always one who sees. The words slid into her mind, bypassing her ears, low and patient and certain. It's your turn to rest. The voice was not cruel. It carried no anger, no threat, only a terrible inevitability, as though it were reading a truth that had been written long ago, long before Lena had ever sat by the window with her pencil and her quiet hands. The world seemed to contract around her. The house, the bed, the very skin she lived in, too tight, too small to hold her any longer. A tremor passed through her, so subtle she might have mistaken it for a chill, but it rooted itself deep inside, somewhere marrow deep. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The whisper did not repeat itself. It didn't need to. The words had settled inside her like seeds, and she knew with the same quiet certainty that had wrapped around her from the first evening she had seen the figure in the tree, that something had shifted, something had begun. She lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling she could not quite see, listening to the silence that now felt very dense and full of breath. Sleep did not return to her. She no longer wished for it. Instead, she listened. The house made no sound, but outside, out there beyond the safety of the walls, the night breathed. The trees whispered to one another, not the wind, but with a slow living murmur that spoke of things ancient and buried, roots pressing deeper into the soil, eyes opening beneath bark, fingers rushing over the thin, fragile surface of the world. She turned her face into the pillow and closed her eyes, but she did not fall asleep again. By the time the grey light of morning seeped into the corners of the room, she hollowed out, scraped clean. The voice's message stayed with her, thudding in the centre of her mind with every step she took. There's always one who sees. It's your turn to rest. It was not an invitation, it was not a demand, it was simply a fact. And slowly, carefully, Lena began to accept it. She said nothing to anyone. There was no one left who would have understood, even if she had tried to explain. Instead, she moved through the house with quiet deliberation, gathering small precious things in a cloth bag, a photograph, a marble, a feather. Objects that felt important in ways she could not explain, only feel. As she folded the cloth around them and tied it shut with trembling fingers, she realized that part of her had already left. Part of her was already waiting, out there beneath the twisted branches and shifting soil, where the watchers knew her name, and soon the rest of her would follow. It happened on a rain-heavy afternoon, when the sky sung low and grey over the fields. Lena sat by her window, sketchbook untouched on her lap, the pencil slipping between her fingers. She hadn't drawn for days, unable to bear the way her own hands betrayed her. Yet she finally turned the page. She found a new drawing waiting for her, one she knew she had not made. It was unmistakably her style, the delicate lines and careful shading, but the image was foreign. In the crook of a gnarled tree, a girl sat calmly amongst the branches, one hand lifted in an idle wave. Her face was obscured by her hair, but there was a warmth in the gesture, almost like an invitation. In the background, almost hidden in the strokes of the shadow, was a second figure, a shape standing at a window, Lena's window, peering out at the tree, watching the girl, watching herself. She stared at it for a long time, cold sinking deep into her chest. That night the whisper came. Lena lay in bed, the covers up to her chin. When she heard it, soft, dry as leaves brushing over stone, it came from outside the window, threading through the cracks of the old house, a voice so close it felt like breath against her ear. There's always one who sees. It's your turn to rest. The words slid into her mind like a hook. She told no one. The world was still when Lena stepped outside. The hour just before dawn was neither night nor morning, suspended in a bruised blue light that made everything seem faded and weightless. The air was cold against her skin, but she barely felt it. She moved across the garden without hesitation, the small cloth bag clutched tightly in one hand. The tree loomed ahead, its black limbs twisted against the paling sky. It should have looked monstrous. It should have made her turn back, but instead Lena felt a slow, aching pull inside her, like a river carving a path through a stone. She was not escaping anything. She was returning, coming back to something that had been waiting for her all along. The rough bark scraped against her palms as she reached the trunk. She paused only for a moment, laying her forehead against the tree's surface. It was warm, almost breathing. She began to climb. At first the motion was heavy, awkward. Her feet searched for footholds. Her arms trembled with the effort of pulling herself upward. But the higher she climbed, the lighter she became. Gravity loosened its grip, and the ache in her muscles faded to nothing. The sounds of the world, the distant hiss of the breeze, the stirring of the unseen creatures in the grass thinned and faded, until there was only silence. A vast, welcoming silence that pressed gently against her ears. Time too softened. The minutes no longer stacked themselves neatly one after another. They unravelled, blurring into a single, endless breath. Lena climbed higher, the branches bending under her weight but never breaking. Above her the sky cracked into a deeper, stranger shade of blue. She moved without fear, without doubt. Somewhere far below the house stood still. The fields still slept beneath fading stars, but those things no longer belonged to her. She belonged here, among the reaching branches and the slow, patient watchers, returning at last to the place she was always meant to be. The climb became effortless near the top, as if the tree itself were lifting her, pulling her toward a place already made. Lena moved from limb to limb, higher and higher until the ground was no longer visible, only the soft blur of the field and the rooftops dissolving into mist. The sky overhead had paled into a thin, brittle silver. The last breath before the first touch of dawn. She knew exactly where she was going. Her hands found familiar grooves in the bark twists and notches she had sketched so many times without understanding. Her body moved as if retracing a path her mind had never fully known. At last she reached it. The thick gnarled branch jutted outward like a crooked arm, halfway between the earth and sky, the place where the Watcher had always sat. But now it was empty. No hunched silhouette, no dark shape woven into the wood, only the rough bend of the branch, streaked with moss, slick with cold. The hollow where she had always seen the figure was bare, waiting. Lena paused, her breath catching for a moment in her throat. A strange hollow ache opened inside her. Not fear, not sadness, something deeper, something like recognition. Without hesitation she swung one leg over the branch and lowered herself into the crook where the Watcher had once rested. The bark was rough against her skin, but she barely noticed. The tree seemed to shift under her weight, settling, cradling her as if she had always belonged there. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. The breeze moved softly through the branches, carrying with it a low, steady whisper too faint for words. The sky lightened slowly, but Leela barely seemed to notice. She felt no urgency, no hunger, no fear. Time peeled away from her, minute by minute, until she was no longer certain she had ever lived anywhere else. She simply waited as the Watcher had once waited, and in the silence between the heartbeats, Lena understood that at last, this was not an ending, it was a beginning. Time became strange. The first light of dawn spilled across the horizon, painting the fields in gold. But Lena barely felt it. A single breath seemed to stretch into hours, a heartbeat into days. She sat in the crook of the tree, weightless and still, and while the world moved steadily around her, she remained untouched by its rhythms. The hunger she had known in her old life had not followed her here. She did not crave food, she did not thirst. Her body, once restless and fragile, had become something else, something steady, patient, whole. The air was enough, the tree was enough. Below her life unfolded as if it were merely another branch, another twist of bark against the sky. People passed along the worn dirt path beyond the garden, heads bowed under the weight of their own small concerns. Children played at the edge of the fields. Neighbours called to one another across fences. None of them looked up. None of them saw her. She watched them without judgment, without longing. She was above it all now, part of something older and quieter than the rushing current of human life. The seasons shifted around her. The warm breath of summer hardened into the brittle chill of autumn. Leaves curled and browned at the edges, drifting to the earth in slow, lazy spirals. They caught in her hair, on her shoulders, but she did not brush them away. Frost came, dusting the world in silver, and she did not move. The tree thickened around her, its bark roughening and splitting in slow, patient waves. She was no longer separate from it. Her skin took on the colour of lichen and dust, her fingertips bending into the coarse, gnarled wood. She was not dead. She was not asleep. She was simply still. Still as the roots that wound deep beneath the ground. Still as the ancient stones half buried in the fields. A watcher, silent and unseen, waiting for whatever came next. Over time her skin changed. The pale softness of her hands roughened, darkened, until it resembled the bark she leaned against. Fine cracks webbed across her arms and fingers, the lines deepening with each passing season. Her hair, once tangled by the wind, stiffened and dulled, blending into the withered branches that crowned her perch. There was no pain, no fear, only a gradual surrender, as natural as the leaves falling in autumn, as inevitable as the slow turning of the earth. Her breath, once a small and shivering thing inside her chest, grew lighter, thinner, until it seemed to leave her altogether. It became the breeze that stirred the highest leaves, the sighing wind that whispered through the hollow spaces between the branches. The boundary between her body and the tree dissolved, and she no longer knew where she ended and it began. Her heart did not beat in the way it once had. Now it pulsed in the steady rise and fall of the wind, in the deep, slow creaking of the wood shifting under sky. Lena no longer needed to move. She no longer needed to think. She was part of the old tree now, woven into its endless waiting, a patient knot of memory and breath. and far below unnoticed the village life carried on, blind to the silent watcher whose eyes had become hollows, whose voice had become the wind. The seasons turned once more, and the village forgot. In the house at the edge of the fields, the one that leaned into the wind, a new family moved in, their arrival was quiet, marked only by the thud of furniture against the old walls, the muffled sound of footsteps pacing unfamiliar floors. Among them was a young man named Theo, with a restless curiosity and a habit of lingering by windows. For a time life settled into its own rhythms. The fields rippled gold under the late summer sun. The thorny woods whispered at the village's edge. The tree in the back garden, black and gnarled against the sky, remained untouched, a forgotten sentinel. One evening, as the sun spilled its last copper light across the fields, Theo wandered into his new bedroom. Restless and half-bored, he drifted to the window without thinking, leaning on the dusty sill, peering out into the sprawling tangle of garden and wood. That's when he saw her, a girl perched in the old tree. She sat so still she might have been carved out of the wood itself. Her hair was tangled with leaves, her arms draped loosely over a thick branch. Though the distance was great and the light was fading, Theo thought, for one heart-stopping moment, that she was staring directly at him. He blinked. The branch was empty. Only the overbearing tree remained, creaking softly in the rising wind. Theo stood frozen at the window for a long moment, the air in his lungs feeling too cold, too thin. He told himself it had been a trick of the light, a shifting shadow, his imagination playing games in the unfamiliar house. But that night he dreamed. In the thick muffled dark of his sleep he walked through a forest of endless trees, their roots writhing underfoot like slow, breathing things. The branches overhead wove into a heavy ceiling, blotting out the stars. Everywhere eyes opened and closed in the bark, watching. And in the distance, barely louder than the hush of wind through dead leaves, came a voice. There's always one who sees. Theo woke with a shudder, the dream already fading like the mist from his mind. But as he lay there staring at the cracked ceiling of his new room, he thought he heard a faint tapping at the window. Soft, patient, waiting. Somewhere beyond the window someone is always waiting. And now it's your turn to see.